The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.
On the morning of January 6th, President Donald Trump's intention was to remain President of the United States.
And we become president, and you are the happiest people.
Reach the line. We need backup.
January 6th was the culmination of an attempted coup.
I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit.
What they were proposing, I thought was nuts.
Over multiple months, Donald Trump oversaw and coordinated a sophisticated 7-part plan to overturn the presidential election and prevent the transfer of presidential power.
Donald Trump and his followers have adopted the words of the songwriter, "Do you believe me or your lying eyes?"
The House committee investigating the January 6th Capitol attack meets today and is expected to refer former President Donald Trump for criminal charges. This is likely the committee's final public meeting after 18 months of work. It will be disbanded in 2 weeks when Republicans take control of the House. Welcome to this special report from the newsroom of the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. Well, today's meeting comes on the eve of the committee releasing a final report looking at the attack on the Capitol, what led up to it, and who the committee wants to hold responsible. For more on what we know about today's meeting, let's go to the Washington Post senior congressional correspondent, Rhonda Colvin. Rhonda, what can we expect today?
Well, one thing we do know is that the chair of this committee, Benny Thompson, has confirmed that there will be criminal referrals made. He has been on the record saying that. We also know that sources who are familiar with the work of this committee say that we can expect that this committee will vote out that former President Trump will face at least 3 criminal referrals that they will send over to the DOJ. Now, how did they come to these exact referrals that they are looking at? Well, the committee has a subcommittee, which is a small working group of members who are also on the panel. It's being led by Jamie Raskin, who is a constitutional lawyer by trade, somewhat of an expert here on the Hill when it comes to constitutional law. He's been leading a subcommittee that has been looking at referrals, ones that are strong, ones that are based on the work that the committee has found through this 18-month investigation. They feel they have the evidence to back up these charges. So that is what we plan to see moments from now, this committee take on that work of voting these referrals out. Now, this is going to be a business meeting. This is not going to be like some of the public hearings that we saw over the summer and even into the fall. There won't be any testimonies or anything like that. They will be voting on these referrals, the criminal referrals and perhaps other referrals that they plan to make. I also know that some members of this committee have been saying that they may drop some new information or at least confirm some other information that we've heard before. And I can tell you as a reporter who's been following this committee since it began, they never have left us without knowing some new information leaving these hearings and leaving these meetings. So we might be able to expect that we will be talking about something brand new after this is over.
Such a great point, Rhonda. I mean, these hearings have been so choreographed and so different from the hearings that we have gotten used to on Capitol Hill over the years, which, you know, take many, many hours. These have been tight, these have been organized, and they have brought results, Rhonda.
They have brought results. In fact, I looked up how many interviews that this committee did last year this time. So last December, they had about 250 interviews that they did. And when they announced that, everyone thought that that was pretty substantial. But right now, as it stands, they've done over 1,000 interviews. So you see how much work that they've done in the last year and a half and how many people have come forward. We've seen many testimonies in person, but the committee has also done interviews behind the scenes remains in closed door. In fact, while they have been getting their report out, which is expected to drop this week, they were able to interview Tony Ornato, who was a person of interest after we heard from Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony that he was a Secret Service agent and also a deputy chief of staff for President Trump. He was he knew and had a lot of knowledge about the inner workings of the days leading up to the 6th, and he was a key person that the committee had been seeking, and we know that that interview just happened. So the committee has been really steady at work this entire time, even weeks up until they are about to drop this report.
Yeah, great point. Thanks so much, Rhonda. I mean, James, one reason why the committee has been able to do this is because it is a cohesive body, right? 2 Republicans, the rest Democrats. They're largely on the same page, though. So let's talk about the page they have to get on in terms of criminal referrals for the former president of the United States. Now, we know, as Rhonda reported for us, of 3 that we expect. Let's take a look at these on the screen here. What we are likely to see today. Take us through them, James, and their significance.
Yeah, 3 potentially very serious charges. To be sure, no former president has ever been charged with a crime in American history. Also, it's worth noting that criminal referrals to the Justice Department from Congress, which are pretty routine, rarely lead to charges. So this is not an indictment by any means, but we do know for sure that they will recommend 3 charges. There are a couple others they had been talking about, and this subcommittee led by Jamie Raskin, it'll be interesting to hear why they decided not to suggest something else like perjury or obstruction of justice or obstruction of a congressional investigation. But the first is an obstruction of an official proceeding of Congress. Essentially, that's the act of the insurrection on January 6th, that there were people who stopped Congress from doing its job of counting the electoral votes when they were supposed to be counted, and that Trump was a participant in that scheme, and that he knowingly behaved in a way that would obstruct the official proceeding. The second charge is a pretty broad statute, and that is conspiracy to defraud the United States, which is often used as sort of a catch-all when it's harder to get more specific, which is that he was trying to use these fake electors to make a representation that he had won the election that he did not win. And then the third is the big one, insurrection. Will be interesting to see the rationale that they lay out for that. That, of course, was the article of impeachment last January, which is that Trump incited the insurrection. And 57 senators voted to convict Trump, a majority in the House. We've learned a lot during the 9 hearings this year that we didn't know last year when Trump was impeached, and about his role, the amount of planning that went into the events leading up to January 6th. So one of the things we don't know is how many people are going to be caught up in this dragnet, how many specific names are going to be thrown out there.
I want to bring in Perry Stein, Washington Post reporter covering the Justice Department. So Perry, let's talk about the powers that Congress has and where they end, because you've been reporting on what it means to have a criminal referral, especially for a former president.
Right. So thanks for having me. So Congress has subpoena powers, they have investigatory powers, but they cannot prosecute. So what they do is they issue these criminal referrals to the Justice Department, and then from there the Justice Department can decide if they want to pursue them or not. So they don't hold, legally speaking, they don't hold any weight. The Justice Department can decide to pursue them or they can decide not to. They're under no obligation to do so. I mean, we do know that the Justice Department has a separate investigation going on, looking into the very same things that largely the same things that the Congressional Committee is. So, it's hard to say how much influence these referrals will have.
Yeah. So talk to us, Perry, about how the Justice Department takes this. I mean, is it added weight as the special counsel looks into the actions of the former president? How is a referral from Congress viewed on the other end?
Right. So I talked to a legal expert about this on Friday, and he was saying that, it probably does hold more weight, a congressional committee submitting a criminal referral than an ordinary citizen or another government agency perhaps issuing a criminal referral. But again, I mean, if they do not see enough evidence to bring forth charges, I mean, I don't think that'll change their calculation if they're just because there is a criminal referral, as this legal expert told me. I mean, to bring forth a case, especially as a high-profile one as this and politically charged one, the Justice Department will likely want to make sure these are airtight cases. So the Congressional Committee doesn't have that same evidence threshold, let's say, as prosecutors bringing forth a case. So just because Congress sees enough evidence doesn't mean that prosecutors will see enough evidence to bring forth charges.
Perry, tell us about the work of this special counsel, Jack Smith. What do we know about the progress that he's making and how the actions of the special counsel are going so far?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know much. It's a pretty closed-lipped operation, so pretty intentionally. So as you mentioned, there's a special counsel, Merrick Garland. Once Trump said he was running and Biden announced his intent to run, he appointed a special counsel. He said he thought these are extraordinary circumstances. He thought that was in the best interest of everyone involved. So the special counsel right now, as far as we know, when they appointed Jack Smith, he was still in The Hague working as an international judge there. He got in a bike accident and hasn't come back since. But what the Justice Department, he's supposed to be coming back, but what the Justice Department has said is that he is working and things are going as planned. We know he has issued a few subpoenas already, and these were to various counties that, have been targets or been at the center of these voter fraud claims.
Perry, catch us up on the investigation involving those classified documents the FBI found at Trump's Florida home, because you're looking at not just these January 6th allegations, but so many other aspects of Trump's legal difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we know is the special counsel was appointed, as you mentioned, to do both the January 6th. Those are cases involved of people who were not on the ground on January 6th. So these were people that could have been involved in planning or encouraging this. So that's what the special counsel is doing, but they are also taking over the Mar-a-Lago document investigation. So that involves the mishandling of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. That's Trump's Florida residence. So I don't know exactly where they are. I mean, in it, there haven't been charges yet, or I don't know if there will be, but there hasn't been that yet in this case. But what we know is that it is an active investigation, and that there's been lots of legal turns involving a special master. Trump lost that case in court, and we got some details about the case, but we do know that they found a lot of classified documents, 103 classified documents marked as classified at Trump's property, and those were found after they issued a subpoena, which Trump said Trump was supposed to hand over these documents, but then they still found 103 marked as classified.
Perry Stein, thank you so much. Thanks for keeping track of all of this. Appreciate your time. James, let's go over these other outstanding investigations, and then we'll turn our focus back to the January 6th committee specifically in a moment. But it is important to put it in the context of all the legal jeopardy that President Trump is in.
It's really astounding when you look at the scope of the various investigations that are ongoing. This special counsel, Jack Smith, is sort of potentially overseeing January 6th related charges against Trump, if any emerge, and those classified documents that Perry was just telling us about. But as you can see on the screen, in Atlanta, which is where Fulton County is, they're looking at efforts to overturn the Georgia election, that infamous Trump call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where he asked him to find 11,000 votes. The Manhattan District Attorney just won a big case against the Trump organization that's being fought on appeal. The New York Attorney General Letitia James also investigating the Trump organization and in trying to essentially prevent Donald Trump and his family members from being corporate directors again. And then in Westchester County, which is just outside of New York City, the suburbs, the district attorney there is looking at whether Trump essentially committed tax fraud by undervaluing his golf course and not paying taxes that he owed. We're also seeing Congress meeting tomorrow to talk about potentially releasing Trump's tax returns. The Ways and Means Committee has been fighting for years to get control of that. Also, as the clock ticks down in the final weeks of the Democratic majority on the House. They're trying to get everything done before Republicans can disband. So a lot of moving pieces in the air, and even if these criminal referrals don't lead to criminal indictments, it still could be kind of an indictment in the court of public opinion, which, considering everything else that's out there in the ongoing 2024 campaign, may be more significant than any of these other investigations.
Rhonda, how has this January 6th committee been able to do some of the legwork and set the table for other investigations that are going on?
Well, they have a very large staff. They have staff attorneys that are available to them. They also are divided up into investigative groups. So there are about 5, and they are all looking at different aspects of the investigation into the 6th. So they did go in with a lot of organization, but you'll remember that it seemed to pick up a lot over the summer when you had testimonies like those from Cassidy Hutchinson, who was the assistant of Mark Meadows, the chief of staff for the president. You saw so many people come out, share what they know, including those in Trump's one-time inner circle, members of his cabinet who also shared information with this committee. So they all sort of came together in a composite way and came up with all of the information that the committee wanted to seek. I've spoken to people who have watched this committee do their work throughout the last year, and it has been, I won't say surprising, but it has been remarkable that they have been able to do so much. When you think about it, there was a question in the days after the 6th of what to do, how to investigate this. Democrats and Republicans could not agree, at least on the House side, of what to do. There, of course, was that push to create a 9/11 style commission to investigate it, and that would have involved people who were third party or independent people who were not members of Congress, who would have come in and examined everything. But Republicans didn't want to do that. And of course, when this committee, the select committee, was established, it first had seats for Republicans, and then the Kevin McCarthy, who's the leader of the caucus over there in the House, he didn't want any of his members on this committee. So there was a lot of argument of how to even approach investigating January 6th, and to see this come full circle today, where you now are expecting potential criminal charges coming down or referred to the DOJ, it's pretty astounding.
Rhonda, you mentioned Cassidy Hutchinson. Some of the most explosive testimony came from her, so let's watch some excerpts of her comments to the committee.
I was in the vicinity of a conversation where I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. The president said something to the effect of, I'm the effing president. Take me up to the Capitol now. To which Bobby responded, sir, we have to go back to the West Wing. The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol. Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel. I remember Pat saying something to the effect of, Mark, we need to do something more. They're literally calling for the vice president to be effing hung. And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. To which Pat said something, this is effing crazy.
Tape of Cassidy Hutchinson and her testimony. Rhonda?
And those were just snippets of what she told this panel. And you'll remember she even included that she was knowledgeable about requests for pardons from sitting members of Congress who knew about the plans for January 6th and asked for pardons ahead of time. She gave them a lot of information, a lot of threads to follow. I'll be interested that when the report drops, how many times her name or her testimonies or deposition are mentioned as key elements of their findings.
James, what does the committee want to leave the American public with here as they prepare to really exit the stage of the public consciousness?
They want, for the historical record, for posterity to lay out what happened and explain how it shouldn't happen again. In addition to the criminal referrals, the committee says in its final report, which we're expecting later this week, there will be recommendations for steps that can be taken. One of the things that's been done is the Electoral Count Act reform, which was actually passed in 1876 after another contested election where there were disputes and claims of fraud. And we do expect that that reform is going to be included in the end-of-year omnibus bill. Pretty significant reform, basically raising the threshold for people to have objections, establishing in the law that the Congress plays sort of a magisterial role and not actually kind of the counting role that people like John Eastman wanted them to play. That's a little in the weeds, though. What the committee wants to convey today is, look, we're going to release all the depositions along with the report later this week of all our interviews. We're going to lay out all the evidence that we accumulated. Maybe you saw it on TV, you know, tens of millions of people were watching, but for the historical record, we want you to know that this was really bad. This was not a spontaneous demonstration of people who just got carried away. They want to convey that Donald Trump was really the driving force behind one of the darkest days in American history.
Rhonda, let's talk about members of Congress and how they have to think about treating their own members, because you laid out for us how many people have come before this committee. Notable names who have not come before this committee are some Republican members of the House.
That's right. There was a group of Republican lawmakers who this committee sought with a subpoena, and if we can bring their faces and names up right now, there was a large list, and it included Kevin McCarthy, who is set to potentially become Speaker. Also, Andy Biggs, who is challenging McCarthy to potentially become Speaker. So you had this group, and the tactic that they used, and even were very frank about it, is that they wanted to kind of run the clock out. When the subpoenas came down, that was only months away before they were expected to take leadership in the House. Some of their lawyers did work with the committee. Mo Brooks, who was the first person on there, he actually said he would testify after he did not get reelected for his seat. But it does show you that there are a group of question marks there with these members of Congress and what this committee might plan to do with them.
James, you know, not only does this committee have to think about how to treat these House members who didn't come before them, who refused to come before them, they have to think about the fact that now the Republicans in this committee won't be back come January because they haven't been reelected, or they chose not to put themselves up for reelection. But the Democrats on this committee, those who are coming back, they will be in the minority next year. And Republicans are already threatening to hold all sorts of investigations. So how much do members of Congress on this committee have to think about how to treat their own?
This has been weighing on them heavily. There have been a lot of debates about how to handle this, whether to do a criminal referral to hold members of Congress in contempt for not speaking to Congress, or whether to refer them to the Ethics Committee. There's been an internal divide, and a lot of it is that this is precedent setting. And one of the things that McCarthy has done is to say to the January 6th committee, save all your records because we're going to investigate the investigators. We're going to review all the work that you did and look for holes. Ultimately, I'm not sure he's actually going to do that, because I think Republican leadership at this point in the House wants to move on, and they don't want to spend 2023 relitigating the 2020 election and January 6, 2021. But essentially, that is one of the threats that McCarthy has made. He's also said, for example, that he's going to kick Adam Schiff off the Intelligence Committee, which is, Schiff is one of the members of the January 6th committee. So it certainly is kind of a do unto others as you'd have done unto you kind of situation, where it definitely is going to set a precedent, and they're cognizant of that.
Of course, important to point out that Steve Bannon, for example, who refused to come aboard this committee, has been given jail time for that. So this is, you know, even though these House members said they wouldn't come, this is not a light decision that the committee members have to make in terms of how punitive to try to be, or to push for either the House Ethics Committee or a law enforcement agency to be with those members.
And they're thinking of themselves, but there's also a general principle, too, of if you don't enforce these subpoenas, then why would anyone come and talk to Congress if there's not going to be any consequences?
You know, Rhonda, we're seeing images right now of some of the police officers who fought to defend the Capitol, some of whom were badly injured and have been in this hearing room meeting after meeting, hearing after hearing, to bear witness to this process. What can you tell us about what's on their minds?
Yeah, you know, when the public phase of hearings started, I spoke with Sergeant Gunnell and also Harry Dunn, who we're seeing on the screen right now, on the days before the very first January 6th hearing. And I asked them, what do you want accomplished from this panel? And they said, you know, we put our bodies on the line to protect them. We just want them to find answers. So earlier today, I talked to Sergeant Gunnell, and he told me how he was feeling going into this, that he thinks that they did uncover a lot, that they perhaps went over expectations. But he also shared with me that Friday was his last day as a sergeant with the Capitol Police. And one of the reasons he said he has decided to resign was because it's hard to be in here with all of these reminders. And he also said that it's hard to be among Republican lawmakers who didn't even want to investigate this in the first place. So that's something that these officers are still grappling with, that the people that they are putting their bodies on the line for have not shown the gratitude the officers think that they should, or have even tried to look into or help further this committee. And of course, as we've been saying, this committee will dissolve after 30 days after they come out of their, drop their report. And so that's it. Although there may still be answers or questions that people are looking for. And also, as we have known in the last year and a half after January 6th, there have been so many details that have come out that perhaps have even shocked this panel. You know, if it makes you wonder if this were to continue, that if investigation into the 6th were to continue, would you uncover even more things? So that's on the minds of a lot of people who are in that room today and are looking at this final meeting as what it is, the final day of the congressional investigation into the 6th.
And recently, the family of Officer Brian Sicknick, who died in the aftermath of the attack on the Capitol, they chose not to shake the hands of Republican leadership, Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, in a very public way. I want to go now to Rachel Weiner, who's a reporter who's been covering the appellate courts in Washington and Richmond. Rachel, I want to talk about the trials that are underway, separate from what's going on here, but of course, very connected. You've been reporting on the Oath Keepers trials. There's a second sedition trial happening now. Who does this one involve?
So this is 5 members of the Oath Keepers who basically, frankly, couldn't fit, 4 members into the first trial. It's the exact same charges, same conspiracy, but they decided they could not put 9 people on trial at once, and so they split it into 2. It's a big advantage, actually, I think, for these members, because the first group was sort of the leadership and they went on trial with founder Stuart Rhodes. Now Stuart Rhodes has said he's willing to testify for any of the people who want him to testify in their defense, but I don't think they want that. I think they're very happy to not have this person who in some ways was, you know, the face of this anti-government movement in court with them.
What was the government able to successfully prove in that first trial?
So they convinced a jury that Stuart Rhodes and one of his deputies engaged in a seditious conspiracy against the United States, but 3 others were not convicted of that. They were all convicted of obstructing the congressional proceeding, which is the same charge former President Trump could face, but they found that only 2 of them plotted enough that it could be considered a conspiracy to go against the U.S. government by force, which is what's required in a seditious conspiracy case. And that was through, they showed many, many messages where Stuart Rhodes was trying to contact Trump, going through avenues of people he knew were in contact with Trump and telling him, don't concede, we'll be behind you, call us up and we will defend your right to stay in office.
Rachel, one of the things we're seeing the January 6th committee do today, as well as throughout their process, is show that this, in their analysis, was an organized attack on the Capitol, that Donald Trump laid the groundwork for it. Here's what one of the attorneys for the defendants said, and I want to read this because it's related. He's arguing that this was not an organized group. These are the Oath Keepers on trial. He described it as a bunch of people who were, quote, out of shape, overweight, elderly, and who wanted to play military. Could that argument work before a jury?
You know, it could potentially on the sedition charges. I think they have a very good chance of being acquitted on those, given that the 3 of the 5 people considered leaders by the government were not convicted on those, and their argument was similar, that it was a lot of talk, but that these were people who did not have the ability to plot a conspiracy against the government. I don't think it'll work in terms of a conspiracy to obstruct Congress, because the fact is, you know, however out of shape and elderly they might have been, they got themselves to D.C., they got weapons to D.C., they made plans for how to potentially use those weapons, and, you know, they were part of a mob that successfully forced Congress to flee in terror for their lives and not certify the vote at the time that they were planning to.
So we're seeing staff at the dais of this committee as they prepare for their members to come in. We believe this will be the final meeting, public meeting of the January 6th committee. We're talking right now to Rachel Weiner, who's been covering the trials of the Oath Keepers. And obviously significant because this is about figuring out just how involved they were on this charge of seditious conspiracy. Rachel, there have been so few trials related to seditious conspiracy in American history. How has that lack of precedent shaped these trials you're covering?
I think it just means prosecutors and defense attorneys, but especially prosecutors, don't even really have a basis of comparison for, you know, how this should go, what a jury might think. And, you know, they had a victory in that they convicted Stuart Rhodes and Deputy Kelly Meggs, but it was in some ways a failure in that they did not convict the other 3 people on trial in the first round, and they're face an uphill battle now because they have 4 people who had even less of a leadership role in Oath Keepers, and they have to convince a jury of this. I think even though they might not know the history exactly, jurors seem to be aware of the fact that sedition, just from the word, is a very potent political charge and might not be willing to go that far with people who were clearly deluded into thinking that this election was stolen, and who were being told by the president that this election was stolen and that this was what they should do in response. And so it seems like there's an unwillingness, at least among some of the public, to blame the conspiracy on these people who are maybe more, you know, being used than they are directing what happened.
Rachel, we all remember that moment that former President Trump told the crowd on January 6th to fight like hell right before they marched to the Capitol and attacked it. Can he be sued for that?
Well, that's a question that the D.C. Circuit is currently debating. There was just oral argument on it, and a district court judge has said, yes, he can be sued, that it basically puts him into a conspiracy, that it's incitement to violence. This is a panel that is not great for those who might like to see him party to a lawsuit. 2 of the judges are ones he appointed to the D.C. Circuit, but I think there was a, you know, there's a general sense that there is a limit to free speech. You know, that this is not just the idea that his lawyers have put forward, which is that speech of any kind by a president is inherently politically important, and therefore cannot be the subject of a lawsuit, that's, you know, kind of absurd on its face, that, you know, the president can say things and do things that open him up to litigation. So I think there is a good chance that the Capitol police officers and lawmakers who have sought to sue the president for the physical and psychological damage that they suffered on January 6th will succeed.
Rachel Weiner, reporter covering appellate courts in Washington and Richmond, thank you so much for your reporting on this. James, this brings up the question of where the responsibility of Donald Trump begins and ends, and where the responsibility of the people who physically marched to the Capitol, broke into it, and attacked police officers, where their responsibility starts and ends.
Yeah, this committee ultimately has focused more on Trump than the individuals, and in fact, they've had several of the Proud Boys testify. They've aired videos of them saying, we came because we thought Trump wanted us to come. Their focus really has been on making the case that this was Trump who convened all these people and less about the individuals. This has actually been a source of dispute within the committee because Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, the 2 Republicans, have wanted to keep the focus on Donald Trump, who they see as a singular threat to the Republic. And some of the Democrats on the committee have wanted to make it more about the ecosystem that created Trump and that allowed Trump to thrive, and the people who were in Trump's orbit. And so this has been a tension. Ultimately, basically the Cheney camp got their way, which was for the committee to really focus on Trump. There were not hearings that had been floated earlier in the year that were sort of about the military response or about the police response. This really was a committee that drilled down deep on what Donald Trump did and didn't do in the run-up to January 6th, on the day of, those 187 minutes that the rioters were in the Capitol, and then in the days afterwards, when he still wouldn't basically concede that he had lost the 2020 election.
And he still won't.
He still won't.
If you're just joining us, we are waiting for this, what we think will be the final public meeting of the January 6th committee. This is a business meeting, so we don't expect witnesses to testify, but as we know, this committee is very effective in needle drops, right, James? And like in sharing news and breaking information, and they have been continuing to interview witnesses all along.
Exactly, including since the last hearing, which was before the midterm elections, remember? And so one of the things I'm interested to see is whether we see any video of Tony Ornato or Bobby Engel, who were the Secret Service related officials who Cassidy Hutchinson talked about. We just saw the clip a few minutes ago of Hutchinson saying, Engel reached for the president's arm, that kind of thing. When she gave that testimony, there were background denials from people who were saying they would go under oath and deny that had happened, but they went under oath, and there has been reporting that they said they didn't recall what happened. And so it really does ultimately validate Hutchinson if they can show what she said and then have these guys saying, oh, I don't remember whether that happened or not.
And there we see Chairman Benny Thompson, Vice Chair Liz Cheney, and the rest of this committee coming to the dais in what we expect will be their final public meeting. This is in the Cannon House office building in the newly named Speaker Nancy Pelosi caucus room, James.
And this is part of her legacy. She pushed this committee through when Republicans really turned on it, when the original proposal that was going to be bipartisan fell apart. Nancy Pelosi really made this happen, and these are the final weeks of her speakership.
Not only the last time that we'll see this committee publicly, we believe the last time we'll see some of these members really speak on Capitol Hill before they prepare to leave Congress.
Yeah, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger both gone next year, and Stephanie Murphy, the moderate Democrat from Orlando, Elaine Luria from the Virginia Beach area, a Democrat, also lost re-election.
All right. Let's go now to the Speaker Nancy Pelosi caucus room and this business meeting of the January 6th committee. The big news out of this so far is we do expect them to make criminal referrals against former President Donald Trump.
A quorum being present, the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material presented during today's meeting, and further, its approval to release deposition material that accompanies release of the Select Committee's final report. Good afternoon, and may God bless the United States of America. To cast a vote in the United States is an act of faith and hope. When we drop that ballot in the ballot box, we expect the people named on the ballot are going to uphold their end of the deal. The winner swears an oath and upholds it. Those who come up short ultimately accept the results and abide by the rule of law. That faith in our system is the foundation of American democracy. If the faith is broken, so is our democracy. Donald Trump broke that faith. He lost the 2020 election and knew it. But he chose to try to stay in office through a multi-part scheme to overturn the results and block the transfer of power. In the end, he summoned a mob to Washington, and knowingly they were armed and angry, pointed them to the Capitol and told them to fight like hell. There's no doubt about this. This afternoon, my colleagues will present our key findings, reminding you of some of the information we presented in earlier hearings and telling you how it fits in our broader conclusions. Those conclusions have helped shape the committee's final report, which we'll adopt today pursuant to House Resolution 503, which establishes the Select Committee nearly a year and a half ago. I expect our final work will be filed with the Clerk of the House and made public later this week. Beyond that release, the Select Committee intends to make public the bulk of its non-sensitive records before the end of the year. These transcripts and documents will allow the American people to see for themselves the body of evidence we've gathered and continue to explore the information that has led us to our conclusions. This committee is nearing the end of its work, but as the country, we remain in strange and uncharted waters. We've never had a president of the United States stir up a violent attempt to block the transfer of power. I believe nearly 2 years later, this is still a time of reflection and reckoning. If we are to survive as a nation of laws and democracy, this can never happen again. How do we stop it? This committee will lay out a number of recommendations in its final report. But beyond any specific details and recommendations we present, there's one factor I believe is most important in preventing another January 6th, accountability. So today, beyond our findings, we will also show that evidence we've gathered points to further action beyond the power of this committee or the Congress to help ensure accountability under law. Accountability that can only be found in the criminal justice system. We have every confidence that the work of this committee will help provide a roadmap to justice, and that the agencies and institutions responsible for ensuring justice under the law will use the information we've provided to aid in their work. And for those of you who have followed this committee's work, I hope we've helped make clear that there's a broader kind of accountability. Accountability to all of you, the American people. The future of our democracy rests in your hands. It's up to the people of this country to decide who deserves the public trust, who will put fidelity to the Constitution and democracy above all else, who will abide by the rule of law, no matter the outcome. I'm grateful to the millions of you who followed this committee's work. I hope we lived up to our commitment to present the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. Let me say in closing, the women and men seated around me on this dais are public servants in the most genuine sense. They put aside politics and partisanship to ensure the success of this committee in providing answers to the American people. I especially want to thank and acknowledge our Vice Chair, who has become a true partner in this bipartisan effort, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming. And I also recognize her for any opening statement that she cared to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your tremendous leadership of this committee. I know we all have benefited greatly from your wisdom and your wise counsel, so thank you very much. In April of 1861, when Abraham Lincoln issued the first call for volunteers for the Union Army, my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Fletcher Cheney, joined the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He fought through all 4 years of the Civil War, from Chickamauga to Stones River to Atlanta. He marched with his unit in the Grand Review of Troops up Pennsylvania Avenue in May of 1865, past a reviewing stand where President Johnson and General Grant were seated. Silas Canfield, the regimental historian of the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry, described the men in the unit this way. He said they had a just appreciation of the value and advantage of free government and the necessity of defending and maintaining it. And they enlisted, prepared to accept all the necessary labors, fatigues, exposures, dangers, and even death for the unity of our nation and the perpetuity of our institutions. I have found myself thinking often, especially since January 6th, of my great-great-grandfather and all those in every generation who have sacrificed so much for the unity of our nation and the perpetuity of our institutions. At the heart of our republic is the guarantee of the peaceful transfer of power. Members of Congress are reminded of this every day as we pass through the Capitol Rotunda. There, 8 magnificent paintings detail the earliest days of our republic. One, painted by John Trumbull, depicts the moment in 1793 when George Washington resigned his commission, handing control of the Continental Army back to Congress. Trumbull called this, quote, one of the highest moral lessons ever given the world. With this noble act, George Washington established the indispensable example of the peaceful transfer of power in our nation. Standing on the west front of the Capitol in 1981, President Ronald Reagan described it this way: the orderly transfer of authority as called for in the Constitution routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony that we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle. Every president in our history has defended this orderly transfer of authority, except one. January 6, 2021 was the first time one American president refused his constitutional duty to transfer power peacefully to the next. In our work over the last 18 months, the Select Committee has recognized our obligation to do everything we can to ensure this never happens again. At the beginning of our investigation, we understood that tens of millions of Americans had been persuaded by President Trump that the 2020 election was stolen by overwhelming fraud. And we also knew this was flatly false. We knew that dozens of state and federal judges had addressed and resolved all manner of allegations about the election. Our legal system functioned as it should, but our president would not accept the outcome. Among the most shameful of this committee's findings was that President Trump sat in the dining room off the Oval Office, watching the violent riot at the Capitol on television. For hours, he would not issue a public statement instructing his supporters to disperse and leave the Capitol, despite urgent pleas from his White House staff and dozens of others to do so. Members of his family, his White House lawyers, virtually all those around him knew that this simple act was critical. For hours, he would not do it. During this time, law enforcement agents were attacked and seriously injured. The Capitol was invaded, the electoral count was halted, and the lives of those in the Capitol were put at risk. In addition to being unlawful, as described in our report, this was an utter moral failure and a clear dereliction of duty. Evidence of this can be seen in the testimony of President Trump's own White House counsel and several other White House witnesses. No man who would behave that way at that moment in time can ever serve in any position of authority in our nation again. He is unfit for any office. The committee recognizes that our work has only begun. It's only the initial step in addressing President Trump's effort to remain in office illegally. Prosecutors are considering the implications of the conduct that we describe in our report, as are citizens all across our nation. In 1761, John Adams wrote, "The very ground of our liberties is the freedom of elections." Faith in our elections and the rule of law is paramount to our republic. Election deniers, those who refuse to accept lawful election results, purposely attack the rule of law and the foundation of our country. The history of our time will show that the bravery of a handful of Americans doing their duty saved us from an even more grave constitutional crisis. Elected officials, election workers, and public servants stood against Donald Trump's corrupt pressure. Many of our committee's witnesses showed selfless patriotism, and their words and courage will be remembered. The brave men and women of the Capitol Police, the Metropolitan Police, and all the other law enforcement officers who fought to defend us that day saved lives and our democracy. Finally, I wish to thank my colleagues on this committee. It has been a tremendous honor to serve with all of you. We have accomplished great and important things together, and I hope we have set an example. And I also want to thank all of those who have honorably contributed to the work of our committee and to our report. We have accomplished much over a short period of time. Many of you sacrificed for the good of our nation. You have helped make history, and I hope helped to right the ship. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. As you know, this is our final meeting of our committee. Over the course of the last year and a half, we presented evidence in 10 public hearings, testimony from our brave law enforcement officers, senior White House, and campaign officials, and many others. Today, we are prepared to share our findings with you. But before we do so, it's important to remember what we've learned, and critically, exactly what happened at the United States Capitol on January 6th. Without objection, I include in the record a video presentation of some of the key evidence our investigation has uncovered.
There were officers on the ground. They were bleeding. They were throwing up. I mean, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood.
As I was swarmed by a violent mob, they ripped off my badge. They grabbed and stripped me of my radio. They seized ammunition that was secured to my body. They began to beat me with their fists and with what felt like hard metal objects.
The key thing to do is to claim victory. No, we won. Fuck you. Sorry, over. We won. Yeah. You're wrong. Fuck you.
Right out of the box on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence.
I didn't think what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time. So that led to me stepping away.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the fraud, maladministration, abuse, or irregularities, if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Mark Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
I told him that I did believe, yes, that once those legal processes were run, if fraud had not been established, that had affected the outcome of the election, then unfortunately I believed that what had to be done was concede the outcome.
What were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point?
Yes.
None.
So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
The numbers are the numbers. The numbers don't lie. We had many allegations, and we investigated every single one of them.
Did one of them make a comment that they didn't have evidence, but they had a lot of theories?
That was Mr. Giuliani.
And what exactly did he say, and how did that come up?
My recollection, he said, we've got lots of theories, we just don't have the evidence. You're asking me to do something that's never been done in history, the history of the United States, and I'm going to put my state through that without sufficient proof
It's a tape earlier in the day of Ruby Freeman and Shay Freeman Moss and one other gentleman quite obviously, surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they're vials of heroin or cocaine.
In one of the videos we just watched, Mr. Giuliani accused you and your mother of passing some sort of USB drive to each other. What was your mom actually handing you on that video?
A ginger mint. Do you know how it feels to have the President of the United States to target you? The President of the United States is supposed to represent every American, not to target one.
I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit.
He wanted to talk about that he thought the election had been stolen or was corrupt, and that there was widespread fraud. And I had told him that our reviews had not shown that to be the case.
And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed.
Well, my first thought was, this is a terrible idea. Jeff Clark cannot be installed as acting Attorney General of the United States.
You ultimately told us that you described this meeting as not this meeting, the Georgia letter that was proposed as an effing murder-suicide pact. Do you remember using the term murder-suicide pact?
Yes.
Was it your impression that the Vice President had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the President, not just to the world through a Dear Colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times. My view was that the Vice President didn't have the legal authority to do anything except what he did.
And I said, hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the Vice President, acting as President of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next President of the United States? And you said yes. And I said, are you out of your effing mind?
The president was, all the attention was on what Mike would do or what Mike wouldn't do.
There's a telephone conversation between the president and the vice president, is that correct?
Yes.
The conversation was pretty heated.
Apologize for being impolite, but do you remember what she said her father called him?
The P word. It was clear that it was escalating and escalating quickly. So then when that tweet, the Mike Pence tweet, was sent out, I remember us saying that was the last thing that needed to be tweeted at that moment. It felt like he was pouring gasoline on the fire by tweeting that.
It gained access to the second floor, and I've got public about 5 feet from me down here below.
Okay, copy. They are on the second floor, moving in now. We may want to consider getting out and leaving now. Copy.
The members of the VP detail at this time were starting to fear for their own lives. There were calls to say goodbye to family members, so on and so forth.
Approximately 40 feet. That's all there was. 40 feet between the Vice President and the mob.
Donald Trump and his allies and supporters are a clear and present danger to American democracy.
We got derogatory information from OSINT suggesting that some very, very violent individuals were organizing to come to D.C.
As Mr. Giuliani and I were walking to his vehicles that evening, he looked at me and said something to the effect of, Cass, are you excited for the 6th? It's going to be a great day. I remember looking at him saying, Rudy, could you explain what's happening on the 6th? He had responded something to the effect of, we're going to the Capitol. It's going to be great. The president's going to be there. He's going to look powerful.
He personally asked for us to come to D.C. that day. And I thought, for everything he's done for us, if this is the only thing he's going to ask of me, I'll do it.
Well, basically, the president, got everybody riled up, told everybody to head on down. So we basically were just following what he said.
Within 15 minutes of leaving the stage, President Trump knew that the Capitol was besieged and under attack.
So are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Secretary of Defense that day?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Attorney General of the United States that day?
No.
Are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Secretary of Homeland Security that day?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Did you ever hear the President
No.
ask for the National Guard? Did you ever hear the President ask for law enforcement response?
No.
You got an assault going on the Capitol of the United States of America. And there's nothing. No call, nothing, zero.
I remember Pat saying something to the effect of, Mark, we need to do something more. They're literally calling for the vice president to be effing hung. And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong.
You on the staff did not want people to leave the Capitol.
On the staff?
In the White House.
I can't think of anybody, on that day who didn't want people to get out of the Capitol once particularly once the violence started. No. I mean,
What about the president?
Yeah.
well, she said the staff. So I answered.
No, I said in the White House.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I thought you said who else on the staff. I can't reveal communications, but obviously I think, yeah.
I said, good, John. Now I'm going to give you the best free legal advice you're ever getting in your life. Get a great effing criminal defense lawyer. You're going to need it.
General Flynn, do you believe in the peaceful transition of power in the United States of America?
Yes, sir.
Another officer unconscious. The turret. What turret?
I don't want to say the election's over. I just want to say Congress has certified the results without saying the election's over, okay?
The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last 18 months, the Select Committee has conducted a congressional investigation of enormous scale, seeking to uncover the depth and breadth of ex-President Trump's multi-part plan to reverse the lawful outcome of the 2020 presidential election. We've compiled an immense volume of documents collected from countless individuals, law enforcement agencies, and federal and state authorities. Many of our efforts to get the evidence required litigation in federal court, including the U.S. Supreme Court. We've taken the testimony of hundreds of witnesses. Now, while we couldn't show them all during the hearings, we focused on those who were most central, including our ex-president's White House aides, his senior Department of Justice officials, and senior members of his campaign. Based on this assembled evidence, the Select Committee has reached a series of specific findings. Now, many of these findings pertain to what has been called the big lie, The enormous effort led by ex-President Trump to spread baseless accusations and misinformation in an attempt to falsely convince tens of millions of Americans that the election had been stolen from him. Beginning even before the election and continuing through January 6th and thereafter, Donald Trump purposely disseminated false allegations of fraud in order to aid his effort to overturn the 2020 election. Ex-President Trump's decision to declare victory falsely on election night wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was premeditated. The committee has evidence that ex-President Trump planned to declare victory and unlawfully to call for the vote counting to stop, and that he told numerous allies about his intent in the weeks before the election. The committee found that Mr. Trump raised hundreds of millions of dollars with false representations made to his online donors. The proceeds from his fundraising, we have learned, have been used in ways that we believe are concerning. In particular, the committee has learned that some of those funds were used to hire lawyers. We've also obtained evidence of efforts to provide or offer employment to witnesses. For example, one lawyer told a witness the witness could, in certain circumstances, tell the committee that she didn't recall facts when she actually did recall them. That lawyer also did not disclose who was paying for the lawyer's representation, despite questions from the client seeking that information. He told her, quote, "We're not telling people where funding is coming from right now." We've learned that a client was offered potential employment that would make her, quote, "financially very comfortable," as the date of her testimony approached, by entities that were apparently linked to Donald Trump and his associates. These offers were withdrawn or didn't materialize as reports of the content of her testimony circulated. The witness believed this was an effort to affect her testimony, and we are concerned that these efforts may have been a strategy to prevent the committee from finding the truth. Throughout the post-election period, ex-President Trump was told repeatedly by his campaign advisors, government officials, and others there was no evidence to support his claims of election fraud. Even since our last hearing, the Select Committee has obtained testimony from new witnesses who've come forward to tell us about their conversations with ex-President Trump on this topic. Here is one of his senior advisors, Hope Hicks.
Seeing evidence of fraud on a scale that would have impacted the outcome of the election, and I was becoming increasingly concerned that we were damaging his legacy.
What did the president say in response to what you just described?
He said something along the lines of, nobody will care about my legacy if I lose. So that won't matter. The only thing that matters is winning.
Despite all that, he continued to purposely and maliciously make false claims, sometimes within a day of being told that a particular claim was false and unsupported by the evidence. By the time the Electoral College met to cast its votes on December 14th, 2020, a number of President Trump's senior staff, cabinet officials, and members of his family were urging him to facilitate a peaceful transition to the incoming administration. He disregarded their advice, and he continued to claim publicly that the election had been stolen from him. Numerous state and federal courts evaluated and rejected the Trump campaign's claims of voter fraud, including 11 judges appointed by ex-President Trump himself. Many of these courts issued scathing opinions, criticizing the lack of evidence that ex-President Trump and his allies had advanced to support their claims. Numerous individuals associated with these efforts have since acknowledged that they were unable to find sufficient evidence of fraud to affect the election results, including in testimony to this Select Committee. Still, Ex-President Trump repeated those false claims and tried to convince his supporters the election was stolen. This was an attempt to justify overturning the lawful election results. Donald Trump knowingly and corruptly repeated election fraud lies, which incited his supporters to violence on January 6th. He continues to repeat his meritless claim that the election was stolen even today, and continues to erode our most cherished and shared belief in free and fair elections. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Building on his constant repetition of the big lie, President Trump engaged in an unprecedented effort to obstruct the joint session on January 6th, the proceeding where his electoral loss would be certified by Congress. This effort began in part in the states, which hold, count, and ultimately determine the winners of presidential elections. Many state officials were targeted by President Trump and his campaign. The local election workers he accused baselessly of election fraud, the state officials he pressured to stop the count or to find votes that didn't exist, and the state legislative officials he urged to disregard the popular will of the voters and their oath of office in order to name him the winner instead. Here are the Select Committee findings about President Trump's state pressure campaign. President Trump and his enablers repeatedly pressured state officials to take action to overturn the results of the election. The most dramatic example of this campaign of coercion was the president's January 2nd, 2021 call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which the president urged the secretary to find 11,780 votes he needed to change the outcome in that state. During that call, President Trump again repeated conspiracy theories about the election that his own appointees at the Department of Justice had already debunked. Trump also made what Secretary Raffensperger apparently considered a threat, accurately considered a threat, suggesting that Raffensperger and his attorney, that they could be subject to criminal prosecution if they didn't follow through with his demands. Then, in repeated telephone calls and in-person meetings, Donald Trump pressured state elections officials and state legislators to alter official election results. But courageous public servants, including Republicans like Rusty Bowers, held firm and refused to put Donald Trump over their oath to the Constitution. When Donald Trump's pressure campaign did not achieve the results he wanted, he oversaw an effort to obtain and transmit false Electoral College ballots to Congress and the National Archives. The false ballots were created by fake Republican electors on December 14th. At the same time, the actual certified electors in those states were meeting to cast their votes for President Biden. By that point in time, election-related litigation was over in all or nearly all of these states, and Trump campaign election lawyers realized that the fake slates were unjustifiable on any grounds and may be unlawful. In spite of these concerns and the concerns of individuals in the White House counsel's office, President Trump and others proceeded with this plan. The Select Committee has developed evidence that these intentionally false documents were transmitted to multiple officers of the federal government and were intended to interfere with the proper conduct of the joint session, where the existence of so-called competing slates of electors would serve as a pretext for legitimate electoral votes to be rejected. President Trump repeatedly attacked state and local officials who refused to do his bidding, as well as local elections workers who he baselessly accused of fraud. As Ruby Freeman and the testimony of other elections officials so powerfully demonstrated, the people who drew President Trump's ire or were the subject of his lies faced real-world consequences, including public harassment and death threats. Some of these elections workers and officials have been forced to leave their homes. Others have been forced to leave the jobs they loved. Take a listen to Ms. Freeman's story.
Now I won't even introduce myself by my name anymore. I get nervous when I bump into someone I know in the grocery store who says my name. I'm worried about who's listening. I get nervous when I have to give my name for food orders. I'm always concerned of who's around me. I've lost my name and I've lost my reputation.
The treatment of Ms. Freeman and her daughter Shay Moss and so many others around the country was callous, inhuman, inexcusable, and dangerous. And those responsible should be held accountable. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly one of the many important components of our federal government is the Department of Justice. It's the body that it's responsible for enforcing our laws and investigating criminal wrongdoing. For this reason, it's of the utmost importance that our Department of Justice operates as a fair and neutral body that enforces our federal laws without fear or without favor. It is this critical function that President Trump sought to corrupt, as he sought to use the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute purported election fraud and to help him convince the public that the election was stolen. The Select Committee has made the following findings with respect to the Department of Justice. In the weeks immediately following the 2020 election, Attorney General Bill Barr advised President Trump that the Department of Justice had not seen any evidence to support Trump's theory that the election was stolen by fraud. No evidence. Over the course of the 3 meetings in this post-election period, Attorney General Barr assured President Trump that the Justice Department was properly investigating claims of election fraud. He debunked numerous election fraud claims, many of which the president would then go on to repeat publicly. And he made clear that President Trump was doing, quote, a great disservice to the country by pursuing them. After Attorney General Barr's resignation, President Trump requested that the acting leadership of the department, Jeffrey Rosen and Richard Donahue, quote, just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressmen. In other words, just tell a small lie to put the facade of legitimacy on this lie, and the Republican congressmen and I can distort and destroy and create doubt all ourselves. Between December 23rd and January 3rd, President Trump called or met with them nearly every day and was told repeatedly the department investigation showed no factual support for Trump's fraud allegations. Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue told him that the fraud claims were simply untrue. As Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue continued to resist, President Trump then tried to install a loyalist named Jeffrey Clark to lead the department as acting attorney general. On several occasions, Clark met with the president, apparently along with Representative Scott Perry, without authorization, promising to take the actions that Barr, Rosen, and Donahue had refused to take. In particular, Mr. Clark intended to send a letter that he had drafted with the help of a political appointee that the White House installed at DOJ with just weeks left in the administration. Mr. Clark intended to send the letter to officials in numerous states, informing them falsely, of course, that the department had identified significant concerns about the election results in their state and encouraging their state legislatures to come into special session to consider appointing Trump rather than Biden electors. Here's Acting Deputy Attorney General Donahue describing his reaction to Mr. Clark's proposed letter.
Some drafting letters without the knowledge of what the department had actually done in terms of investigations, that he was being reckless. And I recall toward the end saying, what you're proposing is nothing less than the United States Justice Department meddling in the outcome of a presidential election.
Knowing that existing department leadership would not support his false election claims, President Trump offered Mr. Clark the job of acting attorney general. In a dramatic January 3rd meeting in the Oval Office, Rosen, Donahue, White House counsel Pat Cipollone, and White House lawyer Eric Hirschman strongly objected to the appointment of Jeffrey Clark as acting attorney general. Mr. Clark pleaded his case and offered to send the letter that he had drafted. The White House counsel called the Clark letter, quote, a murder-suicide pact. Numerous White House and Department of Justice lawyers all threatened to resign if Mr. Clark was appointed. Donald Trump would be leading a graveyard. It was only after the threat of mass resignations that President Trump rescinded his offer to Mr. Clark. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Former President Trump's multi-part plan didn't stop with the states or with the Department of Justice. It touched nearly every component of our federal system, ranging from the courts to Congress to his own Vice President, Mike Pence. In the weeks before January 6th, Mr. Trump turned to the man who had served him loyally for 4 years. He embraced an illegal scheme proposed by John Eastman and others who concocted an unfounded legal theory that the vice president could reject Joe Biden's electoral votes during the joint session. When Vice President Pence and many others, including Trump's own lawyer, John Eastman, told him correctly that former President Trump spearheaded an unprecedented campaign to coerce him to do it anyway, ultimately culminating in a dangerous threat to Mr. Pence's life on January 6th. These are the Select Committee's findings with respect to the pressure campaign against the Vice President. John Eastman admitted in advance of the 2020 election that Mike Pence could not lawfully refuse to count official electoral votes. But he nevertheless devised a meritless proposal that deployed a combination of bogus election fraud claims and the fake electoral ballots to say that Mike Pence, presiding over the joint session, could reject legitimate electoral votes for President-elect Biden. But still, President Trump accepted and repeated Eastman's theory and used it to pressure the vice president to take unlawful action. In multiple heated conversations, President Trump directly pressured Vice President Pence to adopt the Eastman theory and either reject the electors or send them back to the state legislatures. The vice president consistently resisted and repeatedly told the president that he did not possess the authority to do what President Trump directed. This culminated in an angry phone call on the morning of January 6th between President Trump and Vice President Pence, during which the former president repeatedly berated Mr. Pence by cursing and leveling threats. White House staffer Nick Luna was one of the many witnesses who heard the call as it happened. Take a listen at Mr. Luna's testimony.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what did you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, my memory, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, you are a wimp, you'll be a wimp. Wimp is the word I remember. Something to the effect, the wording's wrong. I made the wrong decision 4 or 5 years ago.
In the face of the vice president's resistance, the former president and others exerted both private and public pressure to change his mind. In his speech on the Ellipse on the afternoon of January 6th, former President Trump told the crowd that Vice President Pence needed the courage to do what he has to do. Once the riot began, President Trump deliberately chose to issue a tweet attacking Mr. Pence, knowing that the crowd had already grown violent. Almost immediately thereafter, the crowd around the Capitol surged, and between 2:30 and 2:35 p.m., the Metropolitan Police line on the west front of the Capitol broke. This was the first time in MPD history that a line like this had broken. Rioters at the Capitol were heard chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," through the afternoon. As a result of this unrest, Vice President Pence was forced to flee to a secure location where he actively coordinated with law enforcement and other governmental officials to address the ongoing violence. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Murphy, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ultimately, President Trump did not succeed in bending state and federal officials to his will. At every turn, state officials, the Department of Justice, Mike Pence, and many others stood up for the rule of law and resisted the president's wishes. In that way, our American institutions held after the 2020 election. But that did not stop President Trump. Instead, he turned to his supporters, those who believed his lies about a stolen election. He summoned a crowd to the nation's capital on January 6, hoping that they would pressure Congress to do what he could not do on his own. The Select Committee has made the following findings on this issue. 2 years ago today, in the early morning hours of December 19th, Donald Trump sent a tweet urging his supporters to travel to Washington for a protest on January 6th. "Be there, we'll be wild," he tweeted. Between December 19th and January 6th, the president repeatedly encouraged his supporters to come to Washington. The president's December 19th tweet galvanized domestic violent extremists, including members of the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and organized militia groups. These individuals began organizing to come to the Capitol in large numbers with the specific intent to use violence to disrupt the certification of the election during the joint session. Prior to January 6th, the FBI, Secret Service, U.S. Capitol Police, D.C. government and other law enforcement agencies gathered substantial evidence suggesting the risk of violence at the Capitol during the joint session. These included warnings like the following. Their plan is to literally kill people. Please take this tip seriously and investigate further. President Trump supporters have proposed a movement to occupy Capitol Hill. Alert regarding the VP being a dead man walking if he doesn't do the right thing. I saw several other alerts saying they will storm the Capitol if he doesn't do the right thing. In the days leading up to January 6th, President Trump's advisors explicitly told him that he should encourage his supporters to be peaceful that day, but he refused. One witness, Hope Hicks, provided the committee with records of her text messages on January 6th. In one exchange with another staffer, he texted her, "Hey, I know you're seeing this, but he," referring to President Trump, "really should tweet something about being nonviolent." "I'm not there," Hicks replied. "I suggested it several times Monday and Tuesday, and he refused." When Ms. Hicks came in to provide testimony to the committee, we asked her about this exchange. Her explanation is that the he in this text wasn't the president, but rather it was Eric Hirschman. Take a listen to her testimony.
When you wrote, "I suggested it several times," and it presumably means that the president say something about being nonviolent. You wrote, "I suggested it several times Monday and Tuesday, and he refused." Tell us what happened.
Sure. I didn't speak to the president about this directly, but I communicated people like Eric Hirschman that it was my view that it was important that the president put out some kind of message in advance of the event.
And what was Mr. Hirschman's response?
Mr. Hirschman said that he had made the same, recommendation directly to the president, and that he had refused.
Just so I understand, Mr. Hirschman said that he had already recommended to the president that the president convey a message that people should be peaceful on January 6th, and the president had refused to do that?
Yes.
The public will be able to review this in the transcripts and see the perspective Eric Hirschman gave before we took Hope Hicks's testimony. Despite having knowledge of the threats of violence presented by the crowd gathered on January 6th, President Trump gave an incendiary speech, declaring without basis that the election had been stolen and encouraging his supporters to fight like hell. And during the speech and immediately thereafter, President Trump stated his intention to travel to the Capitol with his supporters in an effort to influence the joint session. The Select Committee has developed evidence indicating that President Trump did, in fact, intend to go to the Capitol on the afternoon of January 6th, and that he repeatedly expressed that intention during the afternoon and in the days prior. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Virginia, Mrs. Luria, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All of President Trump's efforts came to a head on the afternoon of January 6th. Standing on the stage of the Ellipse, President Trump told tens of thousands of angry supporters that the election was stolen, that they had the power to change that if they marched to the Capitol, and that they wouldn't have a country anymore if the presidency was taken away from him. He told them he would be there with them. And then, as the crowd descended on the Capitol, President Trump watched it on television. Despite pleas from his senior advisors, from lawmakers on the Hill, and from his own children, President Trump would not issue a public statement, instructing his supporters to disperse and leave the Capitol. Mr. Trump's failures spanned the period from 1:10 p.m., when his speech ended, and he instructed his supporters to march to the Capitol, to 4:17 p.m., when he finally, begrudgingly, told his supporters to go home. For 187 minutes, he actively disregarded his constitutional obligation to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. As we've established through months of investigation, that is because the mob wanted what President Trump wanted, to impede the peaceful transition of power. These are the Select Committee's findings about President Trump's dereliction of duty. From the outset of the violence, and for several hours that followed, people at the Capitol, people inside President Trump's administration, elected officials of both parties, members of President Trump's own family, and even Fox News commentators who were sympathetic to President Trump, all tried to contact the White House to urge him to do one singular thing, the one thing that all of these people immediately understood was required: instruct his supporters to leave the Capitol. The president repeatedly refused pleas as he watched the violence at the Capitol on television. During the day, the president never spoke with National Guard, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, or any law enforcement agency. At no point during the day, or any other, did he issue any order to deploy any law enforcement agency to assist. Multiple witnesses, including President Trump's White House counsel, testified to these facts. Your White House employees, who had been speaking directly with President Trump, state that he didn't want anything done. The president was making phone calls that afternoon, but they weren't to law enforcement officials. Rather, President Trump continued to call his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Both President Trump and Mr. Giuliani spoke with congressional leaders, even after the violence had begun, to encourage them to continue delaying the session. Approximately 3 hours after being informed of the violence at the Capitol, hours during which, as our evidence has shown, Donald Trump sat in his dining room and watched the violence on television, the president released a video statement in which he again repeated that the election was stolen, told his supporters at the Capitol that he loved them, and ultimately suggested that they disperse. The statement had an immediate impact on elements of the crowd, many of whom have testified that it led them to depart the Capitol. At 6:01 p.m., President Trump sent his last tweet of the day. He did not condemn the violence. Instead, he attempted to justify it. These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away, he wrote. Remember this day forever. There's no doubt that President Trump thought that the actions of the rioters were justified. In the days after January 6th, he spoke to several different advisors. And in those conversations, he minimized the seriousness of the attack. Here's new testimony from another one of President Senior's advisors, Kellyanne Conway.
You said you talked to the president the next day. Tell us about that conversation on the 7th.
Yeah, I don't think it was very long. I just said that was just a terrible day. I'm working on a long statement. I said it's crazy.
What did he say?
No, these people are upset. They're very upset.
In the days following the attack, President Trump also expressed a desire to pardon those involved in the attack, Since then, he's suggested that he will do so if he returns to the Oval Office. In summary, President Trump lit the flame, he poured gasoline on the fire, and sat by in the White House dining room for hours watching the fire burn. And today, he still continues to fan those flames. That was his extreme dereliction of duty. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership of this committee. Generations to come will praise you and the Vice Chair for your unswerving devotion to the rule of law. Several months ago, you tasked several of our members in a subcommittee with bringing recommendations to the full committee about potential referrals to the Department of Justice and other authorities based on evidence of criminal and civil offenses that has come to our attention over the course of our investigation. We are now prepared to share those recommendations today. Mr. Chairman, let me begin with some relevant background considerations to our criminal referrals. The dangerous assault on American constitutional democracy that took place on January 6, 2021 consists of hundreds of individual criminal offenses. Most such crimes are already being prosecuted by the Department of Justice. We proposed to the committee advancing referrals where the gravity of the specific offense, the severity of its actual harm, and the centrality of the offender to the overall design of the unlawful scheme to overthrow the election compel us to speak. Ours is not a system of justice where foot soldiers go to jail and the masterminds and ringleaders get a free pass. Mr. Chairman, as you know, our committee had the opportunity last spring to present much of our evidence to a federal judge, something that distinguishes our investigation from any other congressional investigation I can recall. In the context of resolving evidentiary privilege issues related to the crime-fraud doctrine in the Eastman case, U.S. District Court Judge David Carter examined just a small subset of our evidence to determine whether it showed the likely commission of a federal offense. The judge concluded that both former President Donald Trump and John Eastman likely violated 2 federal criminal statutes. This is the starting point for our analysis today. The first criminal statute we invoke for referral, therefore, is Title 18, Section 1512C, which makes it unlawful for anyone to corruptly obstruct, influence, or impede any official proceeding of the United States government. We believe that the evidence described by my colleagues today and assembled throughout our hearings warrants a criminal referral of former President Donald J. Trump, John Eastman, and others for violations of this statute. The whole purpose and obvious effect of Trump's scheme were to obstruct, influence, and impede this official proceeding, the central moment for the lawful transfer of power in the United States. Second, we believe that there is more than sufficient evidence to refer former President Donald J. Trump, John Eastman, and others for violating Title 18, Section 371. This statute makes it a crime to conspire to defraud the United States. In other words, to make an agreement to impair, obstruct, or defeat the lawful functions of the United States government by deceitful or dishonest means. Former President Trump did not engage in a plan to defraud the United States acting alone. He entered into agreements, formal and informal, with several other individuals who assisted him with his criminal objectives. Our report describes in detail the actions of numerous co-conspirators who agreed with and participated in Trump's plan to impair, obstruct, and defeat the certification of President Biden's electoral victory. That said, the subcommittee does not attempt to determine all of the potential participants in this conspiracy, as our understanding of the role of many individuals may be incomplete even today because they refuse to answer our questions. We trust that the Department of Justice will be able to form a far more complete picture through its own investigation. Third, we make a referral based on Title 18, Section 1001, which makes it unlawful to knowingly and willfully make materially false statements to the federal government. The evidence clearly suggests that President Trump conspired with others to submit slates of fake electors to Congress and the National Archives. We believe that this evidence we set forth in our report is more than sufficient for a criminal referral of former President Donald J. Trump and others in connection with this offense. As before, we don't try to determine all of the participants in this conspiracy, many of whom refuse to answer our questions while under oath. We trust that the Department of Justice will be able to form a more complete picture through its own investigation. The fourth and final statute we invoke for referral is Title 18, Section 2383. The statute applies to anyone who incites, assists, or engages in insurrection against the United States of America, and anyone who gives aid or comfort to an insurrection. An insurrection is a rebellion against the authority of the United States. It is a grave federal offense anchored in the Constitution itself, which repeatedly opposes insurrections and domestic violence, and indeed uses participation in insurrection by office holders as automatic grounds for disqualification from ever holding public office again at the federal or state level. Anyone who incites others to engage in rebelling, assists them in doing so, or gives aid and comfort to those engaged in insurrection is guilty of a federal crime. The committee believes that more than sufficient evidence exists for a criminal referral of former President Trump for assisting or aiding and comforting those at the Capitol who engaged in a violent attack on the United States. The committee has developed significant evidence that President Trump intended to disrupt the peaceful transition of power under our Constitution. The president has an affirmative and primary constitutional duty to act to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Nothing could be a greater betrayal of this duty than to assist in insurrection against the constitutional order. The complete factual basis for this referral is set forth in detail throughout our report. These are not the only statutes that are potentially relevant to President Trump's conduct related to the 2020 election. Depending on evidence developed by the Department of Justice, the president's actions could certainly trigger other criminal violations. Nor are President Trump and his immediate team the only people identified for referrals in our report. As part of our investigation, we asked multiple members of Congress to speak with us about issues critical to our understanding of this attack on the 2020 election and our system of constitutional democracy. None agreed to provide that essential information. As a result, we took the significant step of issuing them subpoenas based on the volume of information particular members possessed about one or more parts of President Trump's plans to overturn the election. None of the subpoenaed members complied, and we are now referring 4 members of Congress for appropriate sanction by the House Ethics Committee for failure to comply with lawful subpoenas. Mr. Chairman, we understand the gravity of each and every referral we are making today, just as we understand the magnitude of the crime against democracy that we describe in our report. But we have gone where the facts and the law lead us, and inescapably, they lead us here. Accordingly, Mr. Chairman, in light of these facts, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be directed to transmit to the United States Department of Justice relevant Select Committee records in furtherance of these criminal referrals.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to notice, I now call up Select Committee's final report pursuant to Section 4A of House Resolution 503. The clerk shall designate the report.
Final report of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
Without objection, the report will be considered read and open to amendment at this point. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Luria, for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report to the House the Select Committee's final report, which includes the committee's legislative recommendations and criminal referrals of Donald J. Trump and others, pursuant to Section 4A of House Resolution 503.
The question is on the motion to favorably report to the House. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Cheney?
Aye.
Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren, aye. Mr. Schiff?
Aye.
Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Aguilar?
Aye.
Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mrs. Murphy?
Aye.
Mrs. Murphy, aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Mrs. Luria?
Aye.
Mrs. Luria, aye. Mr. Kinzinger?
Kinzinger, aye.
Mr. Kinzinger, aye.
How is the chair recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you are not recorded.
Chair votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 9 ayes and 0 noes.
The motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any necessary technical or conforming changes to the report to reflect the actions of the committee. The chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. There being no further business, without objection, the Select Committee stands adjourned.
The January 6th Select Committee ending its public meetings after 18 months of work, and you hear the room breaking out into applause. The headline of this day, it has referred the former president of the United States for criminal charges in 4 different areas, including conspiracy to make a false statement, inciting, assisting, or aiding and comforting an insurrection, and others. This is a special report from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and as we watch these committee members leave the room for what we believe, and they said James will be their last public meeting, I want to bring in James Hohman to talk about what we learned today. James?
This is a significant event. While these criminal referrals aren't binding, the Justice Department isn't compelled to criminally charge the former president. This is the first time that the United States Congress has ever criminally referred a former president for prosecution. The symbolism is incredibly significant, and we heard the somber tone there from Jamie Raskin, who nearly 2 years ago now, we heard making the case to impeach and convict Trump for the same situation. We've learned so much more than we did 2 years ago about everything that went in to the lead up to January 6th.
James, I just want to point out those officers who are sitting there, officers who fought to defend the Capitol, and who have been praised by members of this committee, of course.
Yes, it's hard to overstate how much this has sort of physically and mentally affected the community on Capitol Hill. This is a relatively small town, and this was a very traumatic experience, especially for these folks who feared for their lives that day, faced serious injuries, and also for the staff and the lawmakers. And now this Congress is coming to a close, as you noted, just before this hearing began. 4 of the people we just heard from aren't going to be back next year. It's going to be a very different Congress. And indeed, several of those officers that we see are no longer on the force. They are experiencing, suffering post-traumatic stress disorder and have stepped down or have gone elsewhere. So a lot has changed in 2 years, and it really is, Libby, we've covered all 10 of these hearings. It's just remarkable, the body of work that they put together. Some of those videos, just a reminder of everyone that we've heard from, so much that's been unearthed. One of the things we saw in the last hour was the pictures of the fake elector certificates. And we also today saw new video of Hope Hicks, one of Trump's earliest political advisors and one of his sort of whisperers. And we learned that she tried to urge Trump on the Monday and the Tuesday before the insurrection on that Wednesday, January 6th, to urge people to be nonviolent. And we learned today that according to her, Trump refused to do so. So that was sort of one of the gold coins that we got. We knew we'd get some new information, and that was what they put out there.
Rhonda Colvin had talked to us before the show and shared with us something we learned late last week, that Officer Gunnell has chosen not to rejoin the force. He is having to step away, but he said this was a very tough decision. And the police sergeant has said that he really didn't have a choice because of the injuries he suffered and the situation at the Capitol. Absolutely.
I mean, a lot of the injuries, the back and the neck, but also just mentally being there, being at this workplace. And it's also a very hard dynamic because it's become very politicized, and the Capitol Police in the past never had to worry about that. They were sort of viewed the same by Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, and now for people like Officer Gunnell, they sort of have publicly expressed criticism of some of the Republicans. It makes it just a lot harder for them to be there doing their job of protecting those members.
And it is important to notice, I'm watching people as they come up to the officers, talk to them, some members of the committee, some other members of Congress, and some journalists too, because all of those people were under siege that day.
Yeah.
I mean, those officers defended the Capitol and defended the lives inside, regardless of who they were, regardless if they were Republicans or Democrats or journalists or staffers or the Vice President of the United States even.
And they really humanized the story, and they have been the protective glue. Remember that first hearing, we saw a clip of Caroline Edwards, the officer describing seeing all that blood spread out on the marble floor. They have sort of humanized what otherwise can become sort of a slog through procedural, I mean, obviously very cinematic details, but the procedural fights over what lawyers could say or couldn't say. You see there several other members who were in the room, members of Congress who were not on the January 6th committee, but who have come to watch, and including Abigail Spanberger, who was just reelected in Northern Virginia.
And Madeline Dean. Yeah, Congresswoman Dean. James, where do we go from here? Let's talk about the next steps.
So this is all going to be turned over to Jack Smith, and indeed the referral from the committee names the special counsel who Attorney General Merrick Garland appointed, and he can do with it what he wants. He's not compelled to even respond to Congress. We're also still waiting to get the full report. This is just voting to basically let them put out the report later this week. We've heard Wednesday, but I was sort of struck by how many times they said later this week. This committee has a tendency to let things slip a little bit. They also said, Chairman Benny Thompson, that they're going to release all of the non-sensitive work product and evidence that they've gathered, which would include transcripts of depositions. Interestingly, Thompson said we're going to release those before the end of the year, which is not this week. So you could see multiple tranches sort of come out of this committee before it gets disbanded in the coming weeks. So you could see a report later this week and then transcripts maybe next week. They haven't given a firm timeline.
Let's go to Rhonda Colvin on Capitol Hill. Rhonda, I saw you in that hearing room as we were watching this meeting unfold. I want to put up on the screen what we have learned are the criminal referrals that the committee is making to the DOJ special counsel. Rhonda, let's talk about these 4 items that they are referring the former president on.
Well, we heard from the subcommittee chair, Jamie Raskin, who was a part of that small working group who decided which charges they would recommend to the DOJ, and he ran through them. He ran through the evidence, or at least gave us a hint of the evidence that the committee feels they have uncovered that support all of them. One of them, in fact, being inciting or assisting or aiding and comforting an insurrection. That's one that legal experts are saying might be a hard thing to prove. However, we know that President Trump knew, everyone knew, that Congress would be certifying the election results that day. And the committee says that they have all the evidence that they need to show his knowledge of what was going to be happening that day, and he decided to obstruct it. So all of these 4 charges seem to be very key and linked together, and the committee has also established that they can use a California judge's decision last year as part of their evidence. And also, Congress did impeach Donald Trump on his role in the insurrection. Of course, the House passed that impeachment charge. It did not pass through the Senate once they got done with their trial. But there's a lot of evidence uncovered from that investigation, even though it was far shorter than the January 6th committee's investigation. There's evidence that they can use there too. So overall, the committee feels pretty confident that they have what they need in order to pass these recommendations over to the DOJ for them to do those next steps. And I also will say that what I found key in Raskin's comments is that he said this could also trigger other statutes, other criminal statutes that the DOJ might want to charge Trump with. So, of course, today, this is marking the last day of Congress's investigation into January 6th. But this story seems to continue to go on. And, of course, now the ball is in the court of the DOJ.
James, let's talk about that word insurrection and what it means to hear the former president of the United States connected to that word.
It's legally tricky. There's not a huge body of case law about inciting insurrection. You think of insurrection, you think of the Whiskey Rebellion and various things. What's interesting is the classified documents case might actually be easier to bring and convict. If you read the statute about the documents that Trump has in his possession, it's actually a much more kind of seemingly open and shut case, very cut and dry. This is harder. This requires really showing some level of intent and also showing that Trump did something that no president has ever been charged with before, and it was a political act, et cetera, et cetera.
James, I'm hearing that members of the committee are at the microphones now, at the stakeout. Let's see if we can check in with that.
You know, our criminal referrals were based on the gravity of the offense, the centrality of the actors, and the evidence that we had available to us. And there were undoubtedly other people involved, but we were stymied by virtue of a lot of people refusing to come and testify, refusing to give us the information they had, or taking the Fifth Amendment. So we chose to advance the names of people where we felt certain that there was abundant evidence that they had participated in crimes. And so we're sending those over. It's not to the exclusion of anyone else. And if you read the report, you will see that there are a number of other people named. And of course, that's ultimately going to be up to the Department of Justice.
So will we have, when you guys say Trump, Eastman, and others, will you guys be filling in the blank of others?
No, the others are all contained in our report. And that's a judgment that's going to have to be made by the Department of Justice about whether they have sufficient evidence and probable cause in their case in order to bring charges. We wanted to proceed in such a way that we could all feel certain that these were people where evidence exists that they engaged in criminal offenses against the country.
How quickly do you expect?
Sorry.
What do you see as the legacy of your committee's work?
Oh, geez. Well, our committee is now, I think we've just had our last meeting 5 minutes ago, so I don't know what our legacy is going to be. I hope that our legacy will be an unswerving devotion to the facts, the rule of law, and the Constitution. We were charged with dealing an event that is radically unique in American history. Nobody before, much less a president, had ever come so close to overthrowing a presidential election and bypassing the Constitution. That's what we were dealing with. So our greatest legacy And our most enduring legacy would be one that is certified by time, which is that we never encounter anything like this again, and that we keep the progress of American democracy moving.
Representative Raskin, you mentioned seditious conspiracy in the executive summary. Why did you guys not mention that as one of the statutes today?
Well, seditious conspiracy has been charged with the Oath Keepers. It's been charged with the Proud Boys. There is a rigorous factual proof following particular legal elements that are there. And we brought forth those offenses where we think it's just clear that criminal conduct took place. It's not to the exclusion of others, as I said at the end there. It's very possible that the Department of Justice would have further evidence that could support charges of seditious conspiracy, but of course, that's a judgment that the Department of Justice will have to make based on its...
Are you not then referring on seditious conspiracy?
Seditious conspiracy was not one of the offenses. Seditious conspiracy.
It is in the executive summary.
But yes, as one of the ones that's mentioned there.
But you just
Yes.
Sorry, there's a few days left of the Democratic majority in the 117th Congress. What's the thinking behind just now releasing the totality of the committee's legislative recommendations, as well as referrals to the Ethics Committee, matters that have to be adjudicated by the House and by Congress?
Wait, will you explain? I'm not sure I followed that.
What's the thinking behind waiting until the very end of Democrats' House majority to release matters that have to be dealt with by the House?
Well, we have obviously been in the process of collecting all the evidence that we can, and we've been moving as quickly as possible. The legislative recommendations that we've set forward, there are about a dozen of them, are things that could be undertaken by this Congress still during the lame duck period and by future Congresses, and we're all determined to see that we do take action on them.
Congressman, in your executive summary, you mentioned that there are a number of instances that you have found where the former president tried to influence witnesses. How many instances did you find of that in terms of him either making phone calls to witnesses or trying to influence their testimony?
I don't know an exact number, but the ones that we're aware of, at least the ones I'm aware of, appear in the executive summary. So they are there. You can find them.
How quickly does the committee plan to provide this raw material to the Justice Department? And do you have plans to brief this special counsel about what you found, or has that process been ongoing?
Well, we just adopted the motion to have the chairman send this over, so I imagine it will happen quickly. We just have a few more days in business, so certainly it will happen this week.
Have you been in contact with the special counsel so far up to this point?
Not personally, I have not been, but the chair would undoubtedly. Oh, please.
No, I don't think individual members have, but our staff has been in contact with the Justice Department throughout the process. Obviously, they've made requests along the way, but we expect that the evidence will be, I think, beginning Wednesday, made available with exhibits, transcripts to the public, as well as the Justice Department.
So it was implied during the presentation that there's a discrepancy between Hope Hicks' testimony and Eric Kirschman's testimony. Does the committee believe that she was not truthful during her testimony?
I don't want to comment on any particular witness, but we are providing material that has raised concerns in terms of the credibility of witnesses generally, as well as the role that some of the lawyers representing the former president's interests may have played in trying to influence testimony of the witnesses. So we'll let the record speak for itself, but we want to put that evidence before the public.
I'm going to excuse myself and leave this to Mr.
Representative, can I ask about members of Congress? You guys referred 4 members of Congress, including Kevin McCarthy, to the Ethics Committee. There's been a number of Republican lawmakers that you've mentioned throughout your investigation. Why only these 4, and why was Mo Brooks not included in that list?
Well, the focus of the referrals to the Ethics Committee was essentially placed on their contempt of the committee, contempt of Congress, and failing to show up when they received lawful subpoenas. We did not choose to make referrals based on the underlying conduct, but rather on the essentially open and shut failure to comply with the congressional subpoena.
But you did suggest the Justice Department could potentially bring them in with a grand jury subpoena. Was that talk about the intent behind that.
Well, and this is a broader point that we're trying to make, which is we obviously subpoenaed a number of witnesses, not just members of Congress, who in one way or another refused to comply with the subpoenas. Or they asserted privileges that plainly don't apply, but it would have taken us years to litigate to try to defeat the assertion of those privileges. The Justice Department can move much more quickly. They have the ability to enforce their subpoenas. Our subpoenas, we had to go hat in hand to the Justice Department, and we were batting about 50% when we made a criminal referral for contempt in terms of what the department would prosecute. So they can move more swiftly. It appears, based on public reports, they have moved more swiftly. They have been able to obtain testimony from people who refused to cooperate with us. Now, none of us know exactly what the character of that testimony is and whether witnesses in that testimony asserted privileges that the Justice Department will also have to litigate. But the long and the short of it is we possess evidence that up until this release, the Justice Department may not have. They possess evidence that we don't have, and the cumulative impact of all that evidence will hopefully lead to justice for those that have broken the law here.
Mr. Schiff, Republicans plan to issue their own report saying that there were security failures that day and suggesting that, why was the Capitol not more prepared? Why was that not a focus of this report and this investigation?
It has been a focus of our investigation, and indeed, there will be material in the report that we'll be releasing later this week on that very issue, on the nature of the intelligence that agencies had, the degree to which it was shared or not shared, the degree to which it was acted upon or not acted upon, the coordination or lack of coordination among law enforcement. So those issues are addressed in our report.
Mr. Schiff, did the committee come across any evidence?
Congressman Schiff, committee member, answering questions of the press. James, there is the question of other individuals, right? Because they talked about Donald Trump. They also talked about John Eastman, but then they have left the door open for the special counsel, the Justice Department, to pinpoint other actors in this.
Yeah, Libby, it does seem like this is part of the broader focus we talked about earlier, to keep the focus on Donald Trump. That they want the takeaway from this committee to be that it was Donald Trump who summoned the mob. People thought that they were coming to the Capitol because Trump wanted them to. We do see some other names in some of the work material from the committee that is circulating, including Jeffrey Clark, who was part of the effort by Trump to use the Justice Department to tell states to invalidate their electoral votes. Kenneth Cheeseborough is another name. He was kind of working with Clark, a lawyer who had sort of worked with the Trump campaign, worked with Clark. He's also named in some of the committee's documents. But we heard Jamie Raskin essentially say there that it's going to be up to the Justice Department to look at the evidence and decide for themselves. I'm struck by the committee's restraint, that they did not throw the kitchen sink. This is not, here are 7 charges to file against these 20 different people. It really is squarely focused on Trump and close accessories, Eastman namely among them. And we also know, one of the ways that this is different than a lot of criminal referrals is usually, Libby, when there's a criminal referral, it's because Congress doesn't think that something is on the Justice Department's radar. And so they're saying, we've discovered this criminal potential activity as part of our investigation. We want to make sure that you're looking at it. In this case, we know that the Justice Department is looking at this. Obviously, there have been like 900 people charged related to going into the Capitol on January 6th, but also we know that there has been a subpoena to get the contents of Scott Perry, the congressman from Pennsylvania's phone, who wasn't criminally referred but was referred to the Ethics Committee. We know that John Eastman has faced scrutiny from the Justice Department, that they also seized his phone. So in this particular case, we know that the Justice Department is looking at it. We don't know how advanced the inquiry is, but we know that he's already on their radar, and perhaps that does explain the committee's sort of reticence to go farther and to throw more names on there. But it is sort of striking that they didn't elaborate and say a bunch of other people's names who they haven't hesitated during the previous hearings to name people and call people out. But today, they, I think, wanted to keep it on Trump.
Rhonda, let's go to you for your reaction to what we heard from these members of the committee, as well as the focus on those 2 men, Donald Trump and John Eastman.
Well, I think it is correct in saying that the committee wanted to focus on Trump and Trump alone. And let's remember, he was president at the time, and he is also the only one, in terms of those people who are of interest to this committee, he's the only one who has filed to run for the presidency again. So he's certainly a top figure, always has been. You'll remember when we started these hearings, the committee said that he was a part of a 7-point plan. That is how they organized their work, showing that he was central, showing that he was knowledgeable. And if you think back to the 6th and the days after it, it appeared that Trump was saying that it was just supporters that just cared about the country so much and just got out of hand. Now we know, now we have evidence and testimony that he was very aware of what they were going to do. And even when he gave his speech on the ellipse, he wanted them to go to the Capitol. He wanted to come here as well. So the committee always wanted to make him a central figure, not one that was on the sidelines and other people did the work. They always wanted him to be at the center. I think one thing that stands out to me, and of course this is something I'll be watching in the next year and in the next Congress, is what happens with those referrals that the committee is making to the House Ethics Committee. Now, I know that was the subject of a question that reporters posed to Jamie Raskin just now, because people are wondering, well, why did the committee wait so long with only a few days of Democratic control left in the House? To give some background on the House Ethics Committee, it does run slightly different than other committees on the Hill. It's more private. The staff that helps run it have to be nonpartisan. It's also evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. So it's not a committee that has, loud televised testimonies. It's one that is supposed to be designed to help lawmakers understand the ethics and the code of conduct that should be a part of their lives as lawmakers. So it is going to be interesting to see where that referral goes of those 4 members. Also, those 4 members include Kevin McCarthy, who is one person who is potentially set to be Speaker. The other person is Andy Biggs. He has said he wants to challenge McCarthy for the speakership. Jim Jordan will likely lead the House Judiciary Committee as chair. So these are folks who are not just rank and file members of Congress. These are folks that the committee, they were really interested to know what they knew about the days leading up to the 6th, and these members did not consent to an interview and now may be leading Congress for the next 2 years. So it's just, that's something that is an open question right now. What happens to them? What happens to that referral to the Committee on Ethics?
And we heard at that stakeout there, Rhonda, that very specific delineation of why these 4, as we heard, because members of this committee believe it's an open and shut case of failure to comply. So they said that they're not looking at the underlying conduct rather. There are other members of the House who obviously they had been talking about and bringing up during the investigation process in terms of how they behaved, what they did behind the scenes, and how they perpetuated what the committee sees as Donald Trump's illegal activities. So what happens with any other concerns that the committee's brought up about members of Congress over the past months?
That, again, is also an open question. You'll remember throughout the investigation into the 6th, there was videotape of one lawmaker, Republican lawmaker, who was leading a man who came to the Capitol the next day as one of the rioters. He was leading him through a tour, actually in the space underneath me. That was something that the Capitol Police said that they did not find any wrongdoing with that member of Congress. But again, there's still suggestions that there were sitting members of Congress who knew far more about plans for the 6th, far more about efforts with the fake electors scheme than they may have let on. So I think that that's something that won't really go away, even though Republicans will be taking the helm in the House come January. These are still open questions. And as we've watched over the last almost 2 years, there have been so many developments with January 6th that have come out and caught everyone by surprise. You just don't know what might happen in the future.
James, let's talk about what might happen next to those members of Congress. Rhonda gave us such a good layout of what the House Ethics Committee does, who it's comprised of. But it is a new Congress come January, no matter what.
And a bunch of the members of the Ethics Committee are going to be gone, either by losing or by retirement. We actually, you would need to see some Republicans come over to support sanctions for the Republican members, and that's just not going to happen with Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger gone. Kevin McCarthy, who's one of the people who's been referred, is the person who picks the chairman of the ethics committee. It's not like other committees. And so that person, of course, is not going to support sanctioning McCarthy.
So there may be other recommendations that come out of this report. So far, we just have essentially the introductory materials of this report publicly, but we're waiting to see what happens, what the committee recommends beyond what we've talked about today.
Yeah, so Jamie Raskin in that gaggle that we were listening to said that they're going to have a dozen recommendations, which actually is news. We do not yet know the recommendations. They are not in any of the material that was released today by the committee. So we'll get those later this week. One of the things we do know that they are calling for is changing the Electoral Count Act. And I actually just got an email from someone on the Senate side who's been involved in that effort, saying that they really do think it's going to get included in the omnibus. So that is a major change that they still are expecting to kind of slide through with the spending extension. What's interesting is if the committee has 11 other recommendations and they're waiting till the end of the week to unveil them, there's not a lot of time, and indeed there's really no time to pass them this Congress. And it's hard to see much bipartisan will for broader systemic electoral reforms. This is another area, and one of the reasons I'm eager to see that it doesn't is because this is an area where the committee has been divided. A few months ago, Jamie Raskin wanted the committee to call for abolishing the Electoral College, and Liz Cheney said that that was a non-starter, that this wasn't about that kind of stuff, that this was about Donald Trump. So I'm eager to see what those dozen things are if the report does come on Wednesday.
Well, at the beginning of today's meeting, we heard from the chair and vice chair. And Vice Chair Liz Cheney described what Donald Trump did while the Capitol was being attacked. And she said that his actions, or really inactions at that time, were unlawful. She also called them a dereliction of duty that should prevent him from ever being president again. Let's listen to how she describes what he was doing during the attack.
Among the most shameful of this committee's findings was that President Trump sat in the dining room off the Oval Office watching the violent riot at the Capitol on television. For hours, he would not issue a public statement instructing his supporters to disperse and leave the Capitol, despite urgent pleas from his White House staff and dozens of others to do so. Members of his family, his White House lawyers, virtually all those around him knew that this simple act was critical. For hours, he would not do it. During this time, law enforcement agents were attacked and seriously injured. The Capitol was invaded, the electoral count was halted, and the lives of those in the Capitol were put at risk.
And Rhonda, once again, the vice chair says that should prevent Donald Trump from ever holding any office again.
And really, that summarizes why this committee wanted to make sure that their findings showed that he was central to this. And the hearing, especially, that focused on what they call the dereliction of duty, where he was absent and not doing anything when he could have put out a tweet earlier, when he could have said something earlier, and he did not. So again, this is a part of supporting their claims that he was at the center. And I think even as a person who was here that day, I think this was a part of what was on everyone's mind is when's the help coming? You know, when is he or anybody else going to step in? You'll remember there was that long gap before we even knew if the National Guard could get here. And we saw in one of the last hearings the video of Nancy Pelosi trying to make calls, other leaders in Congress trying to make calls from their secured location to try to figure out how to get help here. And it was the president at the time who did not help out and did not seem to want to say anything until some of his aides were able to get him to put out that tweeted video. So again, this is all a part of the committee's work and how they wanted to make sure that he came away out of this as the central figure.
And James, the committee being careful and precise to say that within 15 minutes of leaving that stage on that day that Donald Trump knew the Capitol was being attacked and chose not to act, and in fact chose to fan the flames.
We've gotten a really good sense of the timeline. And minute by minute. It really is amazing how much we still don't know, considering that this is an 18-month investigation, largely because of the number of people who pleaded the fifth. and didn't talk about their conversations, didn't talk about what was going on in the White House dining room. But we do know how long it took Trump after we know he found out that the Capitol had been breached to weigh in.
I want to get your final thoughts from you as we watch this committee be about to head out the door.
I'm eager to read the full report. I think the depositions, the transcripts will be really revealing. There are going to be nuggets that we'll get from these deposition transcripts that we weren't able to get in the sound bites that have been clipped. But I think that just for the purposes of history, this is a very, very important document that we have learned a lot that we did not know on January 7th, 2022. And we've learned a lot about what was going on with Donald Trump himself. And I thought one of the members said it well, which is that in this country, we don't just hold foot soldiers accountable, we also hold leaders accountable. But in some ways, what happens next is a test of whether that principle is true, that in America, no one is above the law.
Rhonda Colvin, to you for final thoughts today.
Well, you've heard me throughout today refer to this as the end of Congress's investigation of January 6th. And I've been saying that because after watching this whole thing play out, after seeing some of the evidence that we just didn't know back, days or weeks after January 6th, seeing that all play out, it shows you that this story continues. And now, of course, it's in the hands of the DOJ. And I'll, of course, be waiting for the copy of the report as soon as it comes out this week. I know Washington has had its fair share of reports, whether it was the Starr report, whether it was the Mueller report not too long ago. They're usually bestsellers, but if you look at all of those reports and compare it to this one, this is the only one that investigates when a group of Americans attacked their own capital and were led by that president at the time. So this is unique in that it's certainly historical, and I'll be, like everyone else, waiting to see the full report.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Well, the headline of today, the House Select Committee investigating January 6th, is referring former President Donald Trump to the United States Department of Justice for prosecution on 4 fronts, including inciting or assisting in insurrection. Let's talk also about what comes next. We will see the report come out, the final report from this committee, which we will all be digging into here at the Washington Post. And so stay tuned for our reporting on that front as well. A special thanks to James and Rhonda and so many of our colleagues who have been following this every step of the way. I'm Libby Casey. Thank you for joining us today.
The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.